The atmosphere on Xylus 4 did not just smell of death, it smelled of stagnation, a heavy, cloying scent of ancient dust and the sharp ozone tang of high-yield thermal charges. Sergeant Vaccine Cross felt the rhythmic thrum of his bioneural aegis pulsing against his temples, a cold, mechanical heartbeat that kept his breathing steady and his nerves like Durasteel wire. His boots, reinforced with magnetic treads, crunched over the shattered remains of translucent ethel glass. "Front line clear, Sergeant," a voice crackled through his internal comms. It was Jax, a soldier who had spent too many years in the trenches and had the jagged scars to prove it. "The squids are ghosted. Not a single biosign for 5 kilometers. This temple is a tomb." "Copy that, Jax. Maintain perimeter. No loitering on the objective. Keep your eyes peeled for static," Vaxon replied, his voice a gravelly rasp filtered through his tactical helmet. He didn't like the silence. In his 15 years of service to the Sol United hegemony, he had learned that silence was usually just a prelude to something loud and lethal. He kicked open a massive basalt door, the hinges groaning as they turned to slag under the heat of his previous entry charge. Inside, the air was different. It didn't taste like the scorched wasteland outside. It tasted sweet, like crushed lavender and something electric. His rifle light cut through the gloom, illuminating columns that looked less like stone and more like petrified bone, swirling with intricate, glowing veins of silver. At the far end of the hall sat a stasis sarcophagus. It was sleek, organic, and shimmering with a faint, dying blue luminescence. Vaxon approached, his finger tight on the trigger of his pulse rifle. The tactical overlay on his visor began to feed him data strings, red text flickering as it bypassed ethel encryption. "Biosignature detected," the AI in his suit whispered. "Subject, royal bloodline. Classification, Alpha 1, priority capture." Inside the pod, a woman lay suspended in a frost-laced vapor. She was ethel, unmistakably so. Her skin was the color of moonlight, traced with delicate bioluminescent markings that followed the curve of her jaw and the bridge of her nose. Her hair, a cascading river of deep indigo, floated around her as if she were underwater. She wore robes of woven starlight, torn and singed from the orbital bombardment that had leveled the city above. "Found her," Vaxen muttered. "The last one. The crown jewel." The silence was broken by the heavy, rhythmic clank of heavy combat armor. High Marshal Draken entered the chamber, his crimson-trimmed cloak billowing like a cape of blood. He was a man built of scars and ambition, a political shark who saw the galaxy as a map to be colored in hegemony blue. "Excellent work, Cross," Draken said, his voice echoing with a theatrical resonance. He stood before the pod, a predator admiring a trapped bird. The final relic of the ethel dominion. With her, the war isn't just won, it's finalized. "The pod's failing, sir," Vaxin noted, gesturing to the cracks in the canopy. "She needs medical extraction or she'll suffocate in her own stasis fluid. I'll call for a medevac team." "No." Draken held up a gloved hand. He tapped a command into his wrist-mounted console. "High Command has decided on a different path for this asset. We are invoking the right of annexation. Section 4, Paragraph 2. A cold weight settled in Vaxon's stomach. The right was an archaic piece of legislation, a holdover from Earth's brutal past that had been dusted off to incentivize the longest-serving veterans. It turned living beings into property, rewards for the butchers who led the final charge. "Sir," Vaxon said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "She is not a prisoner of war, Sergeant. She is a trophy, a symbol of our absolute dominion." Draken smiled, a thin, cruel line. "And because you were the one to breach the final sanctuary, she is yours. A gift from the hegemony for your decades of service." Vaxan looked at the woman in the pod. She looked impossibly young, her face serene despite the ruin of her world. Behind him, he heard the muffled snickers of his squad. "Damn, Sarge," Jax whispered over the private channel. "Most of us just get a medal and a week of shore leave. You get a princess. Think she's compatible? I hear the squids are flexible." "Shut it, Jax," Vaxon growled. "I accept, sir," Vaxon said to Draken, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. The medical team arrived, but they weren't there to heal. They were there to process. They cracked the pod, the sudden influx of air causing the princess to gasp. Her eyes flew open, luminous, swirling pools of violet and silver. She saw Vaxin first, the black, terrifying visage of his helmet, the rifle held in his hands. A medic slammed a sedative injector into her neck before she could make a sound. Her body went limp. They dragged her out, shackling her wrists and ankles with heavy, magnetic restraints that bit into her pale skin. To the hegemony, she was no longer a person. She was cargo, and Vaxin Cross was her new owner. As they marched back toward the landing shuttles, Vaxin felt the eyes of the entire battalion on him. He had spent his life fighting to liberate systems, or so he had been told. Now, as he watched the unconscious woman being hauled like a crate of munitions, he wondered when he had stopped being a soldier and started being a slaver. The cruiser Obsidian Eye was a beast of a ship, a scarred veteran of 100 planetary sieges. It hummed with the vibration of massive fusion engines, a constant, low-frequency roar that usually soothed Vaxin to sleep. Tonight, it felt like a funeral dirge. Vaxin sat in the small, sterile cabin adjoining the high-security hold. He had insisted on keeping Leora there instead of the brig, claiming she was a high-risk intelligence asset that required constant supervision. It was a lie, but it was a lie that kept the more predatory members of his squad away from her door. Leora sat on the edge of the narrow bunk, her indigo hair hacked short by the medtechs for hygiene purposes. She was awake now, the sedatives having worn off, but she remained motionless. She stared at the magnetic cuffs on her wrists with a hollow, glacial intensity. "Eat," Vaxin said, sliding a tray of synthesized protein across the floor. "We're 4 days out from the Sol system. You won't survive the trip if you starve yourself." Leora didn't look up. Her voice, when it came, was a melodic whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. "You call this survival, Butcher? To be kept in a cage of metal, waiting to be paraded before your masters?" "I'm a soldier, not a butcher," Vaxin replied, though the distinction felt thinner every hour. "And I didn't ask for this. I followed an order." "Following an order," she repeated, finally lifting her eyes to his. The silver markings on her cheeks pulsed with a faint, angry light. "The universal shield of the coward. My father was a man of peace. He believed your words. He opened the lattice to your diplomats, and you turned it into a slaughterhouse. Your peace involved a psychic weapon that fried the brains of our first contact team." Vaxin snapped, standing up. "We did what we had to do to stop the threat." "You saw a mirror," Leora said, her voice rising with a sudden, sharp clarity. "The lattice reflects the heart of the one who touches it. Your people came with greed and fire in their souls. The lattice simply showed you who you were. You were terrified of your own shadows." Before Vaxin could retort, the ship bucked. A violent, bone-jarring shudder threw him against the bulkhead. The red emergency strobes began to pulse, and the high-pitched wail of the proximity alarm screamed through the corridors. "Static!" Vaxin barked into his comms. "Status report." "Sarge, we've got a breach!" Jax's voice was frantic, drowned out by the sound of explosions. "Void Raiders! They hit the starboard burners with a mag torpedo. The ship's tearing apart." Vaxin didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pulse rifle and slammed the release on Leora's cell. "Get up, now!" "Why?" she asked, her expression unreadable. "Let the void take us both." "Not on my watch," Vaxin growled. He grabbed her by the arm, his armored grip firm but surprisingly careful. He dragged her into the corridor just as a secondary explosion vented the atmosphere in the deck below. The Obsidian Eye was dying. Hull plates were buckling, and the screams of trapped soldiers echoed through the vents. Vaxin knew the main escape pods would be a death trap. The raiders would be picking them off like flies. He steered Leora toward the secondary maintenance bay, where the small two-person courier pods were docked. He shoved her into the cramped seat of Pod 09 and fumbled with the straps. His hands, usually steady, were slick with sweat. He slapped his gauntlet against the launch console, overriding the safety locks. "Hold on to something!" he yelled as he jumped into the pilot's seat. The pod ejected with a force that crushed his lungs. Through the tiny viewport, he watched the Obsidian Eye bloomed into a silent, white-hot flower of debris. The Void Raiders were already moving in on the wreckage, but the courier pod was small, cold, and fast. It tumbled through the blackness, caught in the gravity well of the nearest body. a lush emerald green moon designated as Krios Beta. "We're too fast," Vaxon muttered, his fingers dancing across the dead controls. "The thrusters are slagged. We're going to hit the soup." Leora didn't scream. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent chant. Vaxen felt a strange sensation, a hum in his marrow, a feeling of warmth that seemed to buffer the violent shaking of the pod. Then the world went green. The pod sheared through the dense canopy of a 1,000-meter forest, branches snapping like toothpicks against the reinforced hull. The final impact was a bone-shattering stop that sent Vaxon's head into the console. Darkness. Vaxon woke to the sound of hissing steam and the chirping of alien insects. His vision was a blurred mess of red and green. He coughed, the air tasting of chlorophyll and ozone. He checked his vitals. Bruised ribs, a concussion, but alive. He looked to the seat beside him. It was empty. The hatch had been blown off its hinges. "Leora!" he croaked, stumbling out of the smoking wreck. He found her 10 meters away, kneeling in the thick, glowing mud of the jungle floor. She had managed to break her cuffs. The magnetic locks had failed during the crash. She was staring up at the sky, where the twin suns of Krios Beta were beginning to set, casting long, violet shadows across the forest. Vaxine raised his sidearm, his training taking over. "Don't move. Stay where I can see you." Leora turned her head. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, aching sorrow. She looked at the mud on her robes, then at the man in black armor pointing a weapon at her heart. "You should have let me stay on the ship, Vaxon Cross," she said, her voice steady. "Here, the forest listens. Here I am not a prize. I am a part of the song." She stood up, and for the first time, Vaxon saw her not as a prisoner, but as a predator in her own right. The markings on her skin were glowing with a fierce emerald light, echoing the luminescence of the trees around them. "The hunt is over, Butcher," she whispered. "Now, we begin the reckoning." Vaxen felt a ripple of intent, a psychic pressure that made his knees buckle. He realized then that the war hadn't ended on Xylos 4. It had simply changed its rules. The jungle of Krios Beta did not possess the decency to be still. It was a riot of motion, a bioluminescent cathedral where every leaf seemed to breathe and every shadow possessed a heartbeat. Vaxon Cross dragged his left leg through a knee-deep slurry of phosphorescent mud, each movement a jagged bolt of agony that bypassed his suit's local anesthetics. His bioneural aegis was malfunctioning, the internal HUD flickering with erratic warnings. A crimson light blinked at the edge of his vision, a persistent reminder that his internal power cell was down to 15%. He looked up at the canopy. The two suns had finally dipped below the horizon, replaced by a sky of bruised purple and swirling nebulae. The trees, massive things with bark that looked like obsidian, began to glow with a pale, sickly green light. It was beautiful in the way a predator is beautiful right before it strikes. "Keep it together, Cross," he hissed to himself, his breath hitching behind his cracked faceplate. "You're up the creek without a paddle, but you aren't shark bait yet." Leora walked 10 paces ahead of him. She had discarded the singed, heavy silks of her royal office, tearing the fabric to wrap around her feet and forearms. In the twilight of the moon, she looked less like a princess and more like a ghost. She didn't stumble. She didn't struggle. She moved through the tangled roots as if the forest were parting for her, her short hair glowing faintly indigo in the dark. She stopped at the edge of a stagnant pool, the water as black as ink. Vaxen raised his sidearm, the magnetic grip slick with his own blood. "Leora," he barked, the word ending in a cough. "Hold it right there. Don't make me put a hole in you." She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. The silver markings on her cheeks were dim, reflecting her exhaustion. "You can barely stand, soldier. Your suit is leaking coolant, and your heart rate is redlining. Even with that weapon, you are a dead man walking. Why do you still try to command me?" "Because I'm still the one with the trigger," he growled, though his hand was shaking. "Get back over here. We need to find high ground before the local predators decide we're on the menu." Leora looked at the dark water, then back at him. "This moon is alive, Vaxon. It does not have a menu. It has a balance. And right now, you are a loud, clanking disturbance in its song." Vaxin let out a harsh, dry laugh. The song? Is that what you call it? Back at the academy, they told us this moon was a grade 4 death world. Everything here is designed to kill. Your academy taught you how to conquer, not how to listen, she replied, her voice cooling. She stepped toward him, ignoring the pistol aimed at her chest. If I wanted you dead, I would have left you in that pod. I would have let the swamp gas fill your lungs while you were unconscious. Vaxan lowered the gun an inch. Why didn't you? Leora paused, her gaze drifting to the forest. Because even a butcher deserves to see the sun rise one last time. And because I am tired of being the only one left to remember what we lost. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his armored shoulder. Vaxin flinched, but he didn't pull away. He felt a strange sensation, like a low-frequency hum vibrating through his chest. The red warnings on his HUD suddenly stabilized. The grinding pain in his leg didn't vanish, but it became distant, like a memory of a different life. What are you doing? He whispered. Resonance, she said softly. It is not a weapon, Vaxin. It is a bridge. Your suit is killing you. It is trying to turn you into a machine to keep you alive, but your body is fighting back. I am simply quietening the noise. He looked at her, really looked at her, beneath the gold pigment in the ruined silks. She wasn't just an asset. She wasn't a prize. She was a woman who had seen her entire world burn to glass. And here she was, using the last of her strength to ease the pain of her captor. The realization hit him harder than the crash. The silence of the jungle was broken by a long, low howl that sounded like metal being torn apart. It echoed through the trees, followed by a chorus of chittering responses. Stalkers, Vaxin muttered, his military instincts snapping back into place. Glimmer cats. They hunt in packs, and they can see the heat signature of my reactor from 2 kilometers away. Then we must move, Leora said, her eyes wide. There is an old ethel structure 3 kilometers to the north, a singing spire. It is built into the bedrock. We can hide there. 3 kilometers? Vaxin looked at his mangled leg. In this terrain, that's a 6-hour hike. I'll be foobar before we're halfway there. Then lean on me, Leora said, stepping into his space. Vaxin hesitated. His entire life had been defined by self-reliance in the chain of command. To lean on the enemy, to trust the very thing he had been sent to subjugate, felt like treason. But as another howl erupted, closer this time, he realized he didn't have a choice. He draped his heavy armored arm over her slender shoulders. He expected her to buckle under the weight of his Aegis suit, but she stood firm. She felt impossibly strong, her skin radiating a steady, pulsing warmth that seemed to seep through his undersuit. Let's move, he grunted. And Leora? Yes? If we make it, I'll think about the song. They moved through the night, a slow, agonizing crawl through the heart of the whispering mire. The jungle tried to claim them at every turn. They encountered static ferns that sent jolts of electricity through Vaxin's suit, and whispering willows that mimicked the voices of his dead squad mates, calling his name from the darkness. Sarge, help us. It's cold. Jax's voice drifted through the fog, sounding so real that Vaxin almost turned back. Don't listen, Leora whispered, her grip tightening on his waist. It is only the forest reflecting your grief. Keep your eyes on the light. She was the only light he had. Her indigo hair seemed to catch the bioluminescence of the moon, acting as a beacon in the suffocating dark. By the time they reached the base of the singing spire, Vaxin was slipping in and out of consciousness. His vision was a kaleidoscope of static and shadow. The spire rose out of the jungle like a needle of white bone, 300 meters of fluted crystal that hummed with a deep, subsonic frequency. It was beautiful, ancient, and utterly alien. We're here, Leora gasped, her own strength failing. She dragged him through a triangular opening in the base of the spire. As they crossed the threshold, the sounds of the jungle vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling of old parchment and ozone. Vaxin collapsed onto the smooth pearlescent floor, his armor clattering against the stone. He felt Leora slump down beside him, her breathing ragged. We made it, he whispered, his eyes closing. For now, she replied. As the darkness took him, Vaxin didn't think about his mission or his medals. He thought about the warmth of her shoulder against his, and the way she had called him by his name instead of his rank. In the heart of the enemy's sanctuary, the soldier finally slept. Vaxin woke to the sound of a heartbeat. It wasn't his own. It was slower, deeper, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the spire. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. His internal HUD was dead, the power cell finally exhausted, leaving him in the natural twilight of the crystal chamber. He stripped off his helmet, the cool air of the spire hitting his sweat-soaked face. He looked at his leg. The wound had been cleaned and wrapped in a translucent, jelly-like substance that smelled of mint. The swelling had gone down, and the throbbing pain had subsided into a dull ache. Leora was standing in the center of the chamber, her back to him. She was facing a massive crystalline pillar that reached from the floor to the apex of the dome. The pillar was alive with light, swirling with patterns of blue and gold that shifted like liquid. "You're awake," she said, without turning. "What is this place?" Vaxin asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "An archive," she replied. "A library of intent. My ancestors built these spires to store the collective memories of our people. This one? This one holds the records of the border worlds. It holds the memory of your arrival." Vaxin stood up, his hand reflexively going to his empty holster. His pulse rifle lay 10 meters away, its power cell drained. He felt naked without it, a soldier stripped of his purpose. "The hegemony records say you attacked us first," he said, his voice defensive. "At the Oros outpost, 120 colonists were vaporized in a single night." Leora turned, her face pale in the light of the pillar. "The Oros outpost was built on a resonance node. Your people weren't just mining ore. You were drilling into the nervous system of our world. We didn't attack you, Vaxin. We tried to talk to you. We sent a diplomatic team," he countered. "They came back insane, screaming about ghosts and shadows." "Because you sent soldiers disguised as diplomats," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "You sent men with bio-neural Aegis suits, machines designed to suppress emotion. When they touched the resonance, the lattice tried to connect with them. It tried to share our grief, our history, our love. But your suit saw it as a hostile intrusion. They fought back. The insanity you saw was the result of your own technology tearing your minds apart to prevent a connection." Vaxin walked toward the pillar, his eyes fixed on the swirling lights. "That's a hell of a story, Princess. But history is written by the victors." "Then see for yourself," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Step into the light. Touch the pillar." "Are you crazy?" Vaxin backed away. "That thing will fry my brain." "It will show you the truth," she said. "The truth that your High Marshal has spent 12 years trying to bury. If I am lying, let the lattice take me. But if I am right, don't you want to know what you've been fighting for?" Vaxin looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from a decade of war. He thought about the boy he had watched die on Xylos, the one whose insides had been boiled by a psionic mine. He thought about the millions of lives lost on both sides. If it was all a mistake, if it was all a lie. He stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they approached the glowing crystal. Leora took his other hand, her palm warm against his. "I will be your anchor," she whispered. "Do not be afraid." The moment his fingers touched the pillar, the world vanished. There was no spire. There was no jungle. There was only a blinding white light that tasted of salt and electricity. Vaxin felt himself being pulled through a tunnel of light, his consciousness expanding until he could feel the heartbeat of the moon itself. He was standing on the bridge of a ship, not a hegemony cruiser, but something sleek and organic, made of bone and light. He was looking through the eyes of an ethel commander. A human ship appeared on the long-range scanners. It was a jagged, ugly thing of gray steel and protruding cannons. Vaxin felt the commander's curiosity, a warm, golden sensation. They were strangers, but they were not enemies. Not yet. He felt the commander activate the resonance, sending a pulse of pure, shared intent toward the human ship. It wasn't a message of words, it was a feeling of welcome, a hand extended in the dark. Then the feedback hit. Vaxin felt a wave of cold, mechanical hatred wash over him. It was the human ship, broadcasting its own intent: greed, fear, and a desperate need to dominate. The resonance lattice, acting as a mirror, reflected that hatred back with 10 times the intensity. On the human ship, the diplomats screamed as their own darkness was turned against them. They saw monsters where there were only mirrors. They saw a psychic attack where there was only a greeting. Fire! A voice roared in the darkness. The human ship opened fire, its plasma cannons tearing through the organic hull of the lethal vessel. Vaxon felt the commander's shock, then his agonizing grief as the ship began to die. He felt the command to retreat, to defend, to survive. The scene shifted. He saw a room in the hegemony capital 12 years ago. High Marshal Draken, younger but no less cold, sat at a table with a group of corporate executives. "The ethel worlds are rich in Luxor," Draken said, his voice like a whetstone. "If we admit this was a misunderstanding, we lose the mining rights. We lose the terraforming contracts. We lose the war economy that is currently propping up our entire civilization." "But the data is clear, sir," a technician stammered. They were trying to communicate. The technician's screen went black. "Then delete the data," Draken replied. "Reclassify the lattice as a biological weapon. Tell the public the ethel are a hive mind intent on enslaving humanity. We don't need a conversation. We need a conquest." The vision shattered. Vaxon stumbled back from the pillar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fell to his knees, his head spinning. The silence of the spire felt like a physical blow. He looked up at Leora. She was crying, the silver markings on her face pulsing with a soft, mournful light. 12 years, he whispered, the words like ash in his mouth. 12 years of slaughter for a terraforming contract. "It was never about security," Leora said, her voice trembling. "It was about profit. We were just a resource to be harvested." Vaxon buried his face in his hands. He thought of all the men he had killed, all the cities he had turned to glass. He thought of his squad, of Jax and the others, fighting and dying for a lie. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful he thought he would be sick. "I'm a butcher," he choked out. "Everything I believed, everything I am, it's all a lie." Leora knelt in front of him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "You were a tool, Vaxon, a weapon forged by men who saw the galaxy as a ledger. But you are more than your orders. You chose to save me. You chose to listen." "I should have known," he said, his voice cracking. "I saw things that didn't make sense. But I just kept my head down and followed the mission." "We all hide from the truth when it is too heavy to carry," she said softly. "But you have the truth now. The question is, what will you do with it?" Vaxon looked up, his eyes hard. The concussion and the grief were still there. But beneath them, a new fire was beginning to burn. It was a cold, righteous anger that he had never felt before. "Draken is coming for you," he said, his voice regaining its military edge. "He needs you to keep the lie alive. If he gets his hands on you, he'll use the lattice to rewrite the history of the entire galaxy. He'll turn everyone into the machines he wants us to be." "Then we can't let him," Leora said. Vaxon stood up, his leg holding firm. He walked over to his pulse rifle and picked it up. He checked the power levels, still dead, but he gripped it like a lifeline. "We're not going to Sul," he said. "We're going to find a way to broadcast that archive. We're going to show the galaxy exactly what the hegemony is." "But we are only two people," Leora said, "against an empire." Vaxon looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, grim thing, but it was there. "Two people who know the truth," he said. "That's a hell of a lot more than they have. Now let's see if we can find a way to get this spire to talk to the rest of the galaxy." As they stood together in the heart of the ancient archive, the soldier and the princess, the line between captor and prisoner had finally dissolved. They were survivors, bound by a shared sin in a shared purpose. The moon of Krios Beta whispered around them, its song no longer a threat, but a call to arms. Vaxon looked at the pillar one last time. He knew the road ahead would be paved with fire and blood. He knew he would likely never see Earth again. But as he looked at Leora, he realized that for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't just following an order. He was making a choice. "How much power does this place have left?" Vaxon asked, gesturing to the glowing pillar. Enough to send a signal, Leora said, her eyes bright. But we will need a relay, something in high orbit. The Obsidian Eye wreckage, Vaxon realized. The raiders didn't blow the whole ship. The secondary communications array might still be intact. If we can get a signal to it, we can bounce it to the nearest hegemony gate. Then we have a plan, Leora said. Yeah, Vaxon muttered, checking his suit's emergency reserves. A plan that's about 90% suicide. But hey, I've had worse odds on a Tuesday. Leora laughed, a sound so clear and pure it seemed to resonate with the crystal walls. You humans and your Tuesdays. I hope I live to see one. Me too, Princess, Vaxon said, his voice softening. Me too. As they began to work, the spire hummed in approval, its white bone structure glowing brighter against the encroaching jungle. The first seeds of forgiveness had been planted in the dark, and though the harvest would be bitter, the truth was finally beginning to bloom. The atmosphere inside the singing spire was no longer serene. It had become a pressure cooker of vibrating crystal and military desperation. Vaxin Cross stood at the base of the primary archive pillar, his hands moving with the practiced, robotic efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for a slaughter. He wasn't preparing to hunt this time. He was preparing to be the wall. Sit rep, Leora, Vaxin rasped, his voice echoing in the hollow chamber. He was busy field stripping the power packs from 3 discarded ethel pulse cells he'd found in the debris. He was trying to jerry-rig an overcharge trap for the main entrance. Leora was perched on a crystalline ledge 20 feet above him, her fingers pressed against the humming veins of the spire. Her indigo hair seemed to shimmer with the same frequency as the architecture. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in a mask of intense concentration. 3 ships, she whispered, her voice carrying an ethereal weight. Small, fast, and silent. They are not like the cruiser. They move through the air like ghosts. They are already through the upper ionosphere. Vaxon stopped his work for a heartbeat. His jaw tightened. Ghost Squad, Draken's personal cleanup crew. They're the best of the best, Leora, specialized in high-risk retrieval and classified disposal. They aren't here to negotiate or take prisoners. They're here to scrub the map. He returned to his wiring, his movements slightly more frantic. Those boys are my brothers. I trained half of them. I know how they think, and right now they're thinking this is a simple bug hunt. They think you're a high-value asset and I'm a rogue element with a scrambled brain box. Will you kill them? Leora asked, her voice soft, devoid of judgment, but heavy with the gravity of the question. Vaxin paused. The humanistic theme he had tried to ignore, the idea of a second chance, of moving beyond the role of a butcher, felt like a lead weight in his chest. If I don't, they'll put a rail slug through your head and mine before we can say hello. But I'm going to try to keep the body count low. Not for them, for me. Because of the song? She asked, looking down at him. Because I'm tired of being the guy who turns out the lights, Vaxin muttered. Now get back to that console. We need the spire to wake up before they hit the ground. How's the singing coming along? Leora turned back to the pillar. The spire is ancient and stubborn, Vaxin. It has been silent for 12 years. It does not trust the touch of a human-tainted frequency. I have to find the harmony again. I have to apologize to it for the fire your people brought. Well, apologize faster, Vaxin said, slamming a panel shut. We've got maybe 20 minutes before the party starts. He moved toward the triangular entrance, limping slightly on his braced leg. He began setting a series of proximity sensors, small, disc-shaped devices that he'd salvaged from his own suit's emergency kit. He placed them in the shadows of the crystalline outcroppings, hidden from thermal scans. He felt the vibration first, a low, rhythmic thrumming that wasn't the spire's melody. It was the sound of grav-dampened engines. He looked through his cracked visor, squinting at the purple sky. 3 black silhouettes, shaped like jagged arrowheads, descended through the canopy 2 kilometers to the south. No lights, no comm chatter on the standard frequencies. They're Oscar Mike, Vaxin whispered. Leora, get under the shielding of the inner sanctum. Don't come out until I say the word. If they breach the perimeter, you keep singing. You don't stop until that truth is screaming across the galaxy. Vaxin, Leora called out. He stopped, his hand on the frame of the door. Be careful. I can feel their intent. It is cold. It is a void. I know, he said, his voice a flat line. I'm the one who taught them how to be cold. Vaxon stepped out into the humid night of Krios Beta. The bioluminescent jungle was his playground now. He didn't have much, a half-charged pulse rifle, a combat knife, and a few scavenged traps. But he had the terrain, and he had a reason to fight that wasn't found in a hegemony manual. He moved into the dense undergrowth, disappearing like a shadow. He didn't use his suit's active camo. He didn't have the power for it. Instead, he used the natural darkness and the glowing ferns to break up his silhouette. He climbed a massive obsidian bark tree, perched 30 feet above the trail that led to the spire. 10 minutes later, the first of them appeared. They moved in a perfect diamond formation, 4 men in matte black composite armor. Their movements were fluid, silent, and terrifyingly coordinated. They didn't use flashlights. Their visors were likely set to multi-spectrum overlay. Vaxon recognized the lead man by the way he held his rifle. Cradled high, finger resting, just above the trigger guard. It was Silas. Silas had been Vaxon's second-in-command during the siege of Orion's Gate. They had shared rations, shared letters from home, and shared the soul-crushing weight of 100 missions. "Contact!" Silas's voice crackled over a shortwave frequency Vaxon had managed to intercept. "Tango is likely 0 dark 30 in the brush. Watch the canopy. Cross taught us the drop and pop. Don't get lazy." Vaxon felt a pang of bitter pride. They were doing exactly what he'd taught them. "Silas, you idiot," Vaxon whispered to himself. "You're on the wrong side of history." He triggered the first trap. A pulse of overcharged energy erupted from a hidden ethel cell 10 meters behind the squad. It wasn't designed to kill. It was a concussion wave meant to disorient. The black-armored soldiers spun, their rifles tracking the source of the blast. "Flank left," Silas roared. Vaxon didn't flank. He dropped from the tree, falling like a stone onto the rearmost soldier. He didn't use his knife. He used the weight of his armored knee to strike the man's helmet, the impact ringing through the forest. As the soldier went down, Vaxon grabbed his rifle, rolled through the glowing ferns, and fired a non-lethal stun bolt into the second man's chest. "He's in the wire!" another soldier yelled. Vaxon was already moving. He was a blur of black armor and emerald shadows. He didn't fire to kill. He fired at their legs, at their weapon hands, at the joints of their armor. He was using the ethel stun settings on the scavenged rifles, a high-frequency burst that temporarily paralyzed the nervous system. He took out 3 of them in less than 60 seconds, but Silas was faster. Silas hadn't panicked. He had tracked Vaxon's movement through the thermal noise. He fired a burst of live rounds, the slugs whistling past Vaxon's head and shattering a crystalline rock beside him. "Give it up, Vax!" Silas yelled, his voice echoing through the jungle. "You're a deserter. You've gone native with the squids. Draken says you're compromised, but I can still get you a trial if you stand down now." Vaxon ducked behind a massive root, his breathing heavy. "Draken's a liar, Silas. The war is a Charlie Foxtrot. The ethel never attacked us. It was a setup for the mining rights." "Shut up!" Silas screamed, firing another burst. "I don't care about the politics. I care about the mission. You're protecting a biological weapon. She's a woman, Silas, not a weapon." "She's a squid," Silas countered, his voice dripping with the prejudice that had been beaten into them since basic training. "And you're a traitor for touching her." Vaxon felt the humanistic theme being tested to its breaking point. He could kill Silas right now. He had the angle. He could put a round through the neck seal of Silas's armor and end it. But if he did that, he was proving Draken right. He was proving that the only language he knew was death. He looked toward the spire. A brilliant sapphire light began to pulse from the top of the crystal needle. The air began to vibrate with a melodic, low-frequency hum. Leora was doing it. The spire was waking up. "Silas, look at the spire!" Vaxon yelled. "That's not a weapon. It's a broadcast. Listen to the sound." Silas didn't listen. He threw a thermal grenade. The explosion rocked the forest, a wall of white heat incinerating the glowing ferns. Vaxon was thrown backward, his armor sizzling. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. Before he could recover, Silas was over him, the barrel of a pulse rifle pressed against Vaxon's visor. "End of the line, Sarge," Silas said, his voice cold. Vaxon looked up into the mirrored black void of Silas's helmet. He saw his own reflection, a battered, broken man in charred armor. He saw the butcher he had been, and the man he was trying to become. "Do it then," Vaxon whispered. But you're killing the only man who ever told you the truth. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. The spire's melody reached a crescendo, a sound of such profound beauty and sorrow that it seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the soul. For a heartbeat, the jungle was silent. Silas froze. His rifle barrel wavered. What? What is that? Silas whispered. It's the truth, brother, Vaxon said. And it's time the whole galaxy heard it. The interior of the singing spire was no longer a tomb. It had become a living, breathing entity of light and sound. The sapphire glow had intensified until the air itself seemed to be made of liquid jewels. Leora Ilara stood at the center of the archive, her hands raised high, her palms bleeding where the crystalline interface had bonded with her skin. Her face was a mask of agony and transcendence, her eyes glowing with a brilliant, unearthly silver. "Vaxin!" she cried out, her voice amplified by the spire's resonance. "The gate is open. The lattice is reaching for the relays. But I cannot hold it alone. The noise, the hatred from the ships, it is trying to drown out the song." Vaxon stumbled into the chamber, his armor scorched and his left arm hanging limp at his side. Silas followed him, his rifle lowered, his movements hesitant and confused. Behind them, the sounds of more Ghost Squad ships landing echoed through the triangular door. "How much longer?" Vaxon yelled, moving to Leora's side. 2 minutes, she gasped, her body trembling under the strain. "I must maintain the focus. If I falter, the signal will collapse." Vaxen turned to Silas. The test of the humanistic theme was no longer a philosophical debate. It was a matter of life and death. He could see Silas's hand twitching toward his sidearm, the years of conditioning fighting against the undeniable beauty of the spire's broadcast. "Silas," Vaxon said, his voice raw, "I need you, not as a soldier, as a man. Help me hold this door. If they get in here and kill her, the lie stays forever. Your kids will grow up in a galaxy built on a graveyard, and they'll never know why." Silas looked at Leora, then at the sapphire sigil appearing in the air above the archive pillar, the same sigil Vaxon had seen in the vision. Silas's helmet hissed as he unsealed it, revealing a face lined with sweat and doubt. "If this is a trick, Vax," Silas said, his voice shaking, "I'll kill you myself." "It's not a trick, Si. It's a second chance. For all of us." Silas wiped his face and nodded once. He stepped beside Vaxin, raising his rifle toward the entrance. 2 minutes. I can do 2 minutes." Outside, the second wave of Ghost Squad commandos arrived. They didn't bother with stealth this time. They came with heavy plasma casters and tactical shields. The first burst of fire slammed into the crystalline walls of the spire, sending shards of humming glass flying through the air. "Hard contact!" Silas roared, opening fire. "They're using heavy ordnance. The spire won't hold forever." Vaxin joined him, firing his scavenged rifle with pinpoint accuracy. He wasn't aiming for kills anymore. He was aiming for the power packs of their plasma casters, causing them to overload and vent heat, forcing the commandos to retreat. The cost of his choice was becoming clear. He was firing on his own people, on men he had trained to protect a woman his culture told him was a monster. Every shot felt like a betrayal, yet every pulse of the spire felt like a redemption. "Leora, faster!" Vaxin yelled over the roar of the plasma fire. Inside Leora's mind, the universe was a storm of data. She could feel the obsidian eye relay in high orbit, cold and metallic. She could feel the nearby hegemony gate, a needle eye in the void. She pushed her consciousness into the stream, wrapping the truth, the archive of the first contact, the Draken memos, the images of the genocide, in a shell of pure shared emotion. She felt the moment the signal hit the gate. It was like a thunderclap in her soul. "It is away!" she screamed. "The broadcast is live!" At that moment, a heavy thermal charge detonated at the spire's entrance. The shock wave threw Vaxin and Silas across the floor. The sapphire light flickered, then stabilized. High Marshal Draken stepped through the smoke. He wasn't in armor. He wore his crimson dress uniform, his face a mask of glacial, aristocratic fury. In his hand, he held a specialized neural disruptor, a weapon designed to sever psionic connections. "Enough of this theater," Draken said, his voice cutting through the hum of the spire. "Sergeant Thorne, or rather, cross. You have proven to be a far more annoying loose end than I anticipated. Vaccine pushed himself up, his vision blurred. It's over, Draken. The signal is live. The whole galaxy is watching your sins. Draken laughed, a dry, hollow sound. The galaxy is large, Sergeant, and people are remarkably good at ignoring truths that make them uncomfortable. My technicians are already working on a counter-narrative, a terrorist broadcast, a psionic virus. By tomorrow, this will be nothing but a footnote in a history of ethel aggression. He turned his gaze to Leora, who was slumped against the pillar, her strength spent. But she is the source. As long as she lives, the truth has a face, and I cannot have that. Draken raised the neural disruptor, aiming it at Leora's head. No! Silas yelled, lunging forward. Draken didn't even look at him. He fired a pulse from a hidden wrist blaster, the bolt hitting Silas in the shoulder and spinning him away. Vaxin was on his feet, but his rifle was empty. He had nothing but his combat knife and his battered armor. He looked at Leora. She looked back at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying resignation. Vaxin, she whispered, forgive them. The humanistic theme reached its climax. Vaxin saw the man Silas was, wounded and struggling on the floor. He saw the monster Draken was, a man who would kill the future to preserve his power. He realized that the only way to win wasn't to kill Draken, it was to save the truth. Vaxin didn't lunge for Draken. He lunged for the Spire's console. He slammed his armored fist into the crystalline interface, bypassing the security locks with a command code he'd seen Leora use. He poured his own bioneural Aegis energy, the very thing that had been designed to suppress his emotions, into the Spire. The Spire roared. It wasn't a melody anymore. It was a physical force. A shock wave of pure, unfiltered truth erupted from the archive. A psychic flare so powerful that it blew the windows out of the Spire and sent the Ghost Squad commandos outside to their knees. Draken screamed, clutching his head as the weight of 1 billion ethel memories. The joy, the pain, the absolute proof of his crimes slammed into his mind. He fell to the floor, his crimson cloak tangled around him, his eyes rolling back in his head. Vaxin felt it too. He saw the faces of every man he had ever killed. He felt the heat of the fires he had started. He felt the agonizing grief of Leora as her world burned. He felt it all, and he didn't turn away. He let the pain wash over him, a baptism of fire that burned away the butcher and left only the man. The light faded. The Spire went dark, its melody reduced to a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Vaxin lay on the floor, his Aegis suit dead, his body feeling lighter than it had in years. He looked over at Silas. The soldier was sitting up, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. Tears were streaming down his face. I didn't know, Vax, Silas whispered. I really didn't know. I know, Psy, Vaxin said, his voice barely a breath. Now you do. Leora crawled toward Vaxin, her indigo hair matted with sweat. She touched his face, her fingers shaking. The sapphire sigil was still faintly visible on her palm. It is done, she said. The signal was too strong. They cannot suppress it. The galaxy has seen. Vaxin looked at Draken, who was curled in a fetal position, his mind shattered by the resonance. The High Marshal wasn't dead, but the man he had been was gone, replaced by a shell of a human who would spend the rest of his life living with the truth of what he had done. The cost of the battle had been high. The Spire was ruined, Silas was wounded, and the hegemony would undoubtedly send more ships. But as Vaxin looked at Leora, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a weapon. He felt like a guardian. We have to go, Vaxin said, pushing himself up. Draken was right about one thing. This is just the beginning. The hegemony won't go down without a fight. Where can we go? Leora asked. Vaxin looked toward the horizon, where the twin suns were beginning to rise over the bioluminescent jungle. He thought of the forest moon, the sanctuary he had only ever seen in his dreams. To the shadows, Vaxin said, to the places they forgot. We're going to find what's left of your people, and we're going to start building something better than an empire. Before he reached out his hand to Silas. You coming, Psy? Or do you want to wait for the next High Marshal to tell you what to think? Silas looked at Vaxin, then at Leora. He took Vaxin's hand and pulled himself up. I think I'm done with orders, Sarge. Lead the way. As the three of them stepped out of the singing spire and into the morning light of Krios Beta, the jungle seemed to hum with a new frequency. The war prize and the butcher were no more. There was only a survivor, a queen without a throne, and a man who had finally found a second chance worth fighting for. The truth was live, and though the galaxy would burn with the realization, the fire would at last be a purifying one. The Void Hawk was a vessel that felt like a held breath. It was a predator designed for the silent, cold dark between stars. But currently, it was a sanctuary for three souls who had been stripped of their foundations. Vaxin Cross sat in the pilot's chair, his hands light on the controls. The ship's stealth shroud was humming, vibrating through his boots, a constant reminder that they were invisible to the hegemony's long-range sensors, at least for now. 2 days had passed since the singing spire had screamed the truth across the stars. The galaxy was likely in flames, but here in the vacuum, there was only the steady beep of the life support systems and the smell of recycled air and old coffee. We're approaching Velonis Depot, Vaxin said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look back at Silas, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat, staring at a static-filled sensor screen. It's a scrapyard city, Sci, a real hive of scum and villainy. If you're looking for a clean bed and a hot meal, you're barking up the wrong tree. But if you want a fixer who can get us into the shrouded expanse without a transponder, this is the only stop on the line. Silas rubbed his shoulder, where the wound from Draken's blast had been cauterized and sealed. I've spent 10 years cleaning up the messes in sectors like this, Vax. I know how the gears turn. Just feels weird being the guy on the wrong side of the scanner for once. You aren't on the wrong side, Leora's voice came from the hatchway. She stepped into the cockpit, her indigo hair now reaching her shoulders, her ethel markings pulsing with a soft, contemplative light. You are simply on the side that does not have a script. It is a frightening place to be, is it not? Silas looked at her, his expression a mix of awe and lingering suspicion. The conditioning was hard to break. To him, she was still the princess of a race he had been trained to fear. It's something like that, Your Highness. Just trying to figure out if I'm a hero or a dead man. Usually, in this part of the void, you're both, Vaxin grunted. Strap in. Velonis is a mess of orbital junk. If we hit a piece of debris the size of a marble at this speed, we'll be spaced before we can say frack. The depot appeared through the front viewport, a massive, rotating tumor of welded starships, habitat modules, and industrial refuse. It was 3 kilometers wide, a labyrinthine monument to human waste and ingenuity. Neon signs in a dozen different scripts flickered against the hull, advertising everything from black market organs to high-grade fusion cores. Vaxin piloted the Void Hawk into a darkened docking bay on the underbelly of the station. The landing was rough, the magnetic clamps groaning as they seized the ship's landing gear. He shut down the main engines, the sudden silence of the ship feeling heavier than the noise. All right, Vaxin said, unbuckling his harness. Leora, you stay in the hold. Hood up, markings covered. If anyone sees those silver lines, this whole station will turn into a shooting gallery for the bounty hunters. Silas, you're with me. Play the part of the disgruntled merc. Keep your hand on your sidearm, but don't draw unless I give the word. Copy that, Sarge, Silas said, slipping back into the rhythm of the mission. They stepped out of the airlock and into the atmosphere of Velonis. It smelled of burnt copper, unwashed bodies, and the pungent aroma of cheap synthanol. The air was thick with a yellow haze, the byproduct of 100 failing atmospheric scrubbers. The docks were a chaotic hive of activity. Dusters, the station's permanent residents, moved through the corridors in rags, hauling crates of salvaged electronics. Scrappers in exosuits clanked past, their torches sparking as they cut through rusted hull plates. Vaxin led them into a bar called the Gravity Well. It was a dark, cramped hole in the wall, lit by flickering red lamps and filled with the low murmur of desperate conversations. He navigated through the crowd, ignoring the hard stares and the rhythmic humming of cybernetic eyes scanning for a payout. He stopped at a booth in the far corner, where a man with a cybernetic arm was nursing a glass of glowing blue liquid. The man was Kalen, a fixer Vaxin had used a lifetime ago, back when the hegemony still considered him a rising star. Cross, Kalen said, his voice a series of metallic clicks and wheezes. I heard you were KIA on Xylos 4, or maybe I heard you were a traitor. The news these days is a bit of a coin flip. I'm alive, Kalen, Vaxon said, sliding into the booth. And I need a way into the shrouded expanse. Quietly. No transponders, no alliance checkpoints. Kalen's cybernetic eye whirred as it scanned Silas, then flickered toward the entrance of the bar. The expanse? That's Ethel territory, Vax, or what's left of it. The hegemony has a blockade around that sector that could stop a solar flare. It'll cost you. More than you've got. I have information, Vaxon said, leaning in, and I have a client who needs to get home. Shunna. A client? Kalen chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. You mean the girl from the broadcast? The one who broke the High Marshal's brain? She's worth 50 million marks, Vax. Why should I help you when I could just turn you over to General Kravitz's boys and retire on a private moon? Silas shifted his weight, his hand hovering over his holster. The tension in the booth was thick enough to cut with a vibro blade. Vaxon didn't flinch. He looked Kalen in the eye. The real one, not the machine. Because you saw the broadcast, Kalen. You saw the memos. You lost your brother at Orion's Gate, didn't you? He died for a mining contract. You want to spend the rest of your life serving the people who put him in a body bag for a few extra credits? Kalen's expression soured. The clicks of his cybernetic arm slowed. He looked at the blue liquid in his glass, then at Vaxon. Frack you, Cross. You always did know where to poke the bruise. He sighed, a sound of heavy resignation. The shrouded expanse is accessible through the maw, a gravity well near the Krios system. There's a freighter leaving in 6 hours, the Starlight Nomad. It's a junker, but it's got a stealth drive that actually works. I can get you a spot in the hold, but you'll have to move fast. Kravitz's ghost walkers are already crawling all over the station. 6 hours, Vaxon said, nodding. We'll be there. As they left the bar, Vaxon felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to find a group of children huddled in the shadows of a maintenance shaft. They were war orphans, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide with a hunger that went deeper than food. One of them, a girl no older than 10, held out a small, grimy hand. Is it true, she whispered. What the lady in the sky said. Did my dad die for a lie? Vaxon felt a sharp, agonizing pang in his chest. He looked at the girl, then at Silas, whose face was a mask of grief. This was the cost of the prejudice he had helped build. Not just the dead on the battlefield, but the broken lives left in the wake of the hegemony's greed. Vaxon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden bird, a lucky charm he'd carried since his first tour. He placed it in the girl's hand. It's true, Vaxon said, his voice surprisingly gentle. But it's going to change. We're going to make sure it changes. The girl looked at the bird, then at Vaxon. For a moment, the hunger in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of hope. As they walked away, Silas leaned in. That was a risky move, Sarge. Word spreads fast on Shawl. I'm done being a shadow, Cy, Vaxon said. If we're going to ask for a second chance, we have to start giving them. But as they approached the docking bay, the station's alarms began to wail, a high, piercing sound that meant the blockade was closing in. The second chance was going to be bought in blood. The Starlight Nomad was a rust bucket of a ship, a heavy-lift freighter that looked like it had been cobbled together from a dozen different wrecks. It groaned as it pulled away from Valonis Depot, its massive engines vibrating through the floor of the cargo hold. Vaxon, Leora, and Silas were huddled behind a stack of industrial crates, the dim red emergency lights of the hold casting long, distorted shadows. The ship was crowded with refugees, humans and a few Ethel survivors who had managed to hide in the station's underbelly. The air was thick with fear and the smell of unwashed bodies. We're clear of the station, Silas whispered, checking his tactical pad. But we've got 3 hegemony interceptors on our tail. They aren't firing yet. They're waiting for us to hit the maw. Vaxon looked at Leora. She was sitting among a group of human refugees, her hood pulled low. A small human child, perhaps 4 years old, had crawled into her lap, and she was tracing patterns in the air with a soft blue light, making the child giggle. You're surprisingly good with them, Vaxon said, his voice low. Children do not know how to hate, Vaxon, Leora replied, her eyes never leaving the child. They only know how to feel. They are the only part of your race that hasn't been poisoned by the lattice's echo. The ship suddenly lurched, followed by the muffled boom of a plasma bolt impacting the shields. The refugees cried out, huddling closer together. "They're ranging us!" Silas yelled, jumping to his feet. "They're trying to disable the engines." Vaccine grabbed his rifle. "See, get to the cockpit. Tell the captain to dump the ballast and hit the afterburners. We need to reach the Maw's gravity well before they can lock on." As Silas ran toward the front of the ship, the Starlight Nomad shuddered again. This time the explosion was internal. A hull plate in the cargo hold buckled, venting atmosphere into the void. The emergency shutters slammed shut, but not before three black-armored commandos, the Ghost Walkers, breached the hold through the gap. They were equipped with jetpacks and magnetic boots, moving through the low-gravity environment with terrifying precision. They didn't fire at the refugees, they fired at Vaxon. "Cross!" one of them roared through his helmet's speakers. "Surrender the asset and we'll give you a quick end." Vaxin dived behind a crate, returning fire. The pulse bolts sparked off the commandos' kinetic shields. These weren't the confused soldiers from the Spire. These were true believers, men who had been modified to feel nothing but the mission. "Leora, get the civilians into the subhold!" Vaxin screamed over the roar of the depressurization alarms. Leora didn't move toward the subhold. She stood in the center of the cargo bay, her indigo hair swirling around her in the shifting gravity. She looked at the commandos, then at the terrified refugees cowering behind her. One of the commandos raised a heavy plasma caster, aiming not at Vaxin, but at the group of refugees. "Surrender, or they all burn!" Vaxin froze. His tactical mind was calculating the odds, and they were zero. He couldn't kill three Ghost Walkers before they opened fire on the civilians. The humanistic theme, the value of a second chance, was being tested by the coldest logic of war. "Wait!" Vaxin yelled, stepping out from behind the crates. "I'll surrender. Just let them go." The commando leader chuckled. "We don't need you alive, Cross. We just need the girl." He began to squeeze the trigger. Leora closed her eyes. The silver markings on her face ignited with a brilliance that blinded everyone in the room. A wave of resonance erupted from her, but it wasn't a spike of rage. It was a shield. A dome of translucent sapphire light enveloped the refugees. The plasma bolt hit the shield and dissipated into a shower of sparks. Leora slumped to her knees, the effort of protecting so many souls draining her life force. Vaxin didn't waste the opening. He lunged at the nearest commando, tackling him into a stack of crates. They tumbled through the low gravity, a mess of black armor and desperate strikes. Vaxin used his combat knife to jam the commando's jetpack, sending the man spinning into the bulkhead. Silas appeared at the hold's entrance, firing his rifle. "Vax, the Maw's opening! We're hit! The freighter is breaking up!" The Starlight Nomad was caught in the intense gravity of the Maw, a black hole-adjacent anomaly that acted as a gateway to the shrouded expanse. The ship's hull was groaning, the sound of tearing metal filling the hold. "Everyone to the life rafts!" Silas screamed, ushering the refugees toward the emergency pods. Vaxin saw the commando leader struggling to his feet, his plasma caster still active. The man was aiming at the life rafts, a final, spiteful act of a dying soldier. Vaxin could have run for the rafts. He could have saved himself. But he saw the faces of the children, the orphans of his own war, and he knew what he had to do. He didn't fire his rifle. He ran at the commando leader, his boots clanking against the floor. "Cross, don't!" Silas yelled. Vaxin slammed into the leader just as the man fired. The plasma bolt went wide, incinerating a stack of empty crates. The two men wrestled at the edge of the hull breach, the void of space tugging at their armor. Vaxin saw the man's visor. He saw the fear behind the glass. In that moment, he didn't see an enemy. He saw another version of himself, a man lost in a lie. "It's over, brother," Vaxin said, his voice calm. "You don't have to do this." The commando froze. For a heartbeat, the mission and the conditioning seemed to falter, but the gravity of the Maw was too strong. The hull plate they were standing on snapped. Vaxin felt the cold pull of the void. He felt himself being dragged toward the event horizon, but a hand caught his. It was Leora. She was anchored to the ship by a vine-like strand of crystalline energy, her eyes burning with a desperate silver fire. With her other hand, she was reaching for the commando leader. "Grab my hand," she screamed at the man in black armor. The commando looked at the Ethel princess, the woman he had been sent to kill. He looked at her hand, extended in a gesture of absolute forgiveness. He reached out, his gloved fingers inches from hers. But a piece of debris, a jagged shard of the freighter's engine, slammed into the commando's chest, knocking him back into the void. He vanished into the blackness of the maw without a sound. Leora let out a cry of pure, agonizing grief. She hadn't just tried to save an enemy, she had felt his death as if it were her own. Vaxon pulled himself back into the ship, dragging Leora with him. They collapsed onto the floor of the last remaining life raft as the Starlight Nomad was torn apart by the gravity well. Silas slammed the launch button. The raft shot into the maw, caught in the swirling currents of the shrouded expanse. They were thrown into a kaleidoscope of violet and gold light, the world spinning until everything was a blur. When the spinning stopped, they were drifting in a sea of crimson gas. The maw was behind them, a silent, swirling eye in the dark. Ahead of them lay a dozen ruined planets, the remnants of the Ethel heart world. The life raft was quiet. The refugees were huddled together, safe. Silas was at the small navigation console, his hands shaking. Leora was sitting on the floor, her head in her hands, weeping. Vaxen knelt beside her, his own heart feeling as if it had been through a meat grinder. "You tried to save him," Vaxen said, his voice a whisper. "After everything they did to you, you still tried." "He was a soul, Vaxen," she sobbed. "He was a soul that had been taught to hate. He deserved a second chance as much as you do." Vaxen looked at his hands. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't just a word or a feeling, it was a burden. It was the choice to carry the weight of the past so that the future could be light. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. "We're in the expanse," Silas said, his voice breaking the silence. "But it isn't empty. We've got incoming biosigns. Dozens of them. They're Ethel ships, Sarge." Vaxen stood up, pulling Leora with him. He looked out the viewport at the fleet of organic, bone-white vessels emerging from the crimson clouds. This was the resistance. This was the end of their journey, or perhaps the real beginning of the war. But as he looked at the survivors in the raft, the humans and the Ethel, sitting together in the dark, he knew that the truth had already won a victory that no fleet could ever claim. They had found the one thing the hegemony could never mine, terraform, or conquer. They had found their humanity. "Ready, Princess?" Vaxen asked. Leora wiped her eyes and stood tall, the silver markings on her face glowing with a steady, defiant light. "I am ready, Vaxen Cross. Let us go home." As the Ethel fleet closed in, the Voidhawk survivors prepared to face a new world, one where the butchers and the prizes were gone, replaced by people who had looked into the maw and chosen to forgive. The transition from the violent, swirling gravity of the maw to the stillness of the Athelas star system felt like a sudden plunge into deep water. The life raft, a scorched metal husk barely holding its atmosphere together, drifted through a nebula of soft amber and pale violet gas. In the distance, the skeletal remains of orbital stations hung like frozen ghosts, a testament to the century of war that had pulverized this sector. Vaxen Cross stood by the viewport, his hands clasped behind his back in a soldier's rest he no longer felt he deserved. He watched the white-boned ships of the Ethel Resistance glide toward them. They were elegant, terrifying things, shaped like reaching fingers or frozen waves, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent hum that felt like a vibration in his teeth. "You okay, Sarge?" Silas asked, his voice cracking the silence. He was sitting on a crate, nursing a stim pack. His armor was a mess of carbon scoring and jagged tears. "You've been staring at the black for an hour. If you're waiting for the cavalry, I think they just arrived, and they don't look like they're bringing medals." "I'm not looking for medals, Cy," Vaxen said without turning. "I'm looking for a way to explain 100 years of genocide to people who have every reason to space us the moment they crack the airlock." Leora walked to the front of the raft, her indigo hair catching the amber light of the nebula. She looked at the approaching fleet, her fleet, and then at Vaxen. The silver markings on her face were pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that seemed to harmonize with the distant ships. "They will not space you," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the cramped hold. "They will judge you. There is a difference. To a guy like me, Princess, judgment usually comes in the form of a short walk out a long airlock, Vaxon muttered, a trace of his old cynical street slang slipping through. I've spent 15 years being the bad guy in their story. You think they're going to give me a second chance because I helped you crash a few ships? I think they will give you a chance because I will demand it, she countered, her gaze firm. But you are right about one thing. The truth we broadcast from the spire was just the beginning. Now we have to live in the wreckage it left behind. The life raft was caught in a tractor beam, a gentle, humming pull of gravitic energy that drew them into the bay of the flagship, the radiance of Valoran. When the airlock cycled open, the atmosphere that rushed in wasn't the recycled metallic air of a hegemony cruiser. It was cool, moist, and smelled of blooming night jasmine and ancient rain. A phalanx of Ethel warriors met them. They were tall, slender, and wore armor that looked like it had been grown from iridescent pearl and obsidian. They didn't carry pulse rifles. They held long, elegant staves that crackled with psionic potential. The leader stepped forward, his eyes like polished obsidian. He looked at Leora and fell to one knee, a gesture mirrored by every warrior in the bay. Princess Ilara, we thought the bloodline was severed. We thought the song had ended. It has changed, Commander Voron, Leora said, her voice echoing with a regal authority. But it has not ended. Voron stood up, his gaze shifting to Vaxin and Silas. His expression hardened into a mask of glacial hatred. And these? You bring the butchers into our heart? You bring the very shadows that burn Xylos? These men are the reason I am standing before you, Leora declared. Vaxin Cross defied his own high marshal. He chose the truth over his orders. Voron's staff hummed, a low, menacing sound. A butcher who stops chopping is still a butcher. The council will demand their lives as restitution for the millions lost. It is the law of the lattice. A life for a life, a soul for a soul. Silas stood up, his hand reflexively twitching toward his empty holster. Whoa, easy there, Slim. We're on the same side now. We did the heavy lifting to get the word out. Vaxin stepped in front of Silas, his hands raised, palms open. It was a gesture of total surrender, one he had never made in his entire military career. Let him go, Voron. He was following me. If you need a soul for the ledger, take mine. I've got enough blood on my hands to fill this bay. But don't tell me I'm on the wrong side of history when I'm the one who helped you write the new one. The tension in the bay was a physical weight. Silas looked at Vaxin, shock written across his face. Vax, what the frack are you doing? We didn't survive the maw just to roll over. I'm not rolling over, Psy, Vaxin said, his voice steady. I'm accepting the bill. For the first time in my life, I'm actually paying for what I've done instead of just following a mission profile. Leora watched him, her violet eyes swirling with a mixture of grief and pride. She saw the humanistic theme blooming in him. The realization that forgiveness wasn't just something you received. It was something you had to earn through the courage to be vulnerable. Voron hesitated. He looked at the princess, then at the human soldier who stood before him without fear or weapons. He had seen thousands of humans through the sights of a rifle, but he had never seen one like this. The Council of Elders will decide, Voron said, his voice less certain. Until then, they will be confined to the reflection chambers. If they truly seek a second chance, let them find it in the silence. The reflection chambers were not cells. They were small, circular rooms made of translucent crystal, overlooking the Amber Nebula. There were no bars, only a shimmering field of energy that hummed when Vaxin approached. He sat on the floor, his back against the cool wall, watching the distant stars. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time was different in the shrouded expanse. Silas was in the chamber next to his, pacing like a caged animal. Vax, Silas called out through the crystalline wall. You still with me, Sarge? Or have you gone full mystic on me? I'm here, Silas, Vaxin replied. I've been thinking, Silas said, his voice dropping, about that girl on the station. The one with the wooden bird. I keep seeing her face, and I keep seeing the faces of the squids. I mean, the Ethel we processed on the frontier. I used to tell myself it was just cleaning the sector. But sitting here, in their house, it feels different. It's the resonance, Sci, Vaxon said. It's not a weapon. It's just making you feel what you've been ignoring for 10 years. It's the cost of waking up. It's a hell of a price, Silas muttered. I don't know if I can carry it. You don't have to carry it alone, Vaxon said. That's what I'm starting to figure out. We spent our lives being machines because we were afraid of the weight. But Leora, she's been carrying the weight of her whole dead race, and she still found room to catch me when I fell. Leora appeared at the entrance to his chamber, the energy field parting for her. She looked weary, the silver lines on her face dimmed. The council is divided, she said, sitting across from him on the floor. The elders remember the fire. They remember the screaming. They want to use the lattice to broadcast a psychic pulse that will shut down every hegemony ship in the quadrant. It would be a slaughter, a final, definitive end to the human threat. Vaxon's heart sank. They want to become us. They want to be the butchers. Yes, Leora whispered. They say it is the only way to be safe. They say that humanity is a virus that cannot be cured, only contained. They have seen your history, Vaxon. They have seen the 1,000 years of war you brought from your home world. They do not believe in second chances. And you? Vaxon asked. I told them about the soldier who treated my leg in the jungle, she said, a small smile touching her lips. I told them about the man who dived into the maw to save a child who wasn't his. I told them that the lattice is not a mirror of your race's past, but a bridge to its future. She reached out and took his hand. But they need more than my words, Vaxon. They need a bridge. They have agreed to a summit, a final negotiation with the sole united hegemony's provisional government. But they require a catalyst, a shared resonance. What does that mean? Vaxon asked, a sense of dread creeping into his mind. It means a human and an ethel must link their minds publicly, she explained. Not through a machine, but through the lattice itself. It will broadcast the combined intent of both races. If the link is pure, the galaxy will feel the peace. If there is even a trace of deception or hatred, the feedback will kill everyone in the link. It is the ultimate test of trust. Vaxon looked at his hands. The hands of a soldier, a killer, a man who had only just started to understand the meaning of the word peace. I'm the human, aren't I? He asked. You are the only one who can do it, Vaxon, Leora said, because you are the only one who has lived on both sides of the lie. But it is a choice. I will not order you. I will not ask you as a prize or a prisoner. Vaxon looked out at the amber nebula. He thought about Silas, about the girl with the bird, about the billions of people on Earth who were still living in fear. He thought about the man he wanted to be. When do we start? Vaxon asked. The resolution was no longer just a broadcast of data. It was a broadcast of the soul. The secondary characters, Silas, Voron, the refugees, were all watching, their own beliefs being challenged by the sight of a butcher choosing to lay bare his heart. The aftermath of the climax was a slow, painful awakening, but the road to Geneva was finally open. The orbital station convergence hung in the neutral space between the hegemony's inner rim and the shrouded expanse. It was a massive ring of white stone and gray steel, a physical manifestation of the two cultures trying to find a way to exist without destroying each other. Inside the central amphitheater, the air was thick with the tension of 1,000 years of conflict. On one side sat the Ethel Council, led by Commander Voron. On the other sat the Provisional Human Government, a group of shell-shocked admirals and diplomats led by General Eris, the woman who had helped Vaxon escape Earth's orbital fortress. Vaxon Cross stood at the center of the floor, wearing a simple black tunic, stripped of all military markings. He felt more exposed than he ever had in the heat of a planetary breach. Beside him stood Leora Ilara, her silver robes shimmering under the artificial lights. This is madness, Admiral Vance, a hardliner from the hegemony, spat from the gallery. You're asking us to link our defense grid to a psychic network controlled by an alien species? It's a surrender disguised as a treaty. It is not a surrender, Admiral, General Eris said, her voice echoing with a weary authority. It is an invitation. We have seen the data. We have seen the truth of how this war began. If we continue the fight, there will be nothing left to govern but a graveyard. We need a bridge. And you expect this traitor to be that bridge? Vance pointed a trembling finger at Vaxon. He's a deserter, a man who sold out his race for a pretty face. Vaxon stepped forward, his boots clicking on the marble floor. He didn't look at the Admiral. He looked at the cameras, at the millions of people watching from across the galaxy. I didn't sell out my race, Admiral, Vaxon said, his voice calm and steady. I found it. For 15 years, I thought being human meant being the strongest, the fastest, the most lethal. I thought being a soldier meant following orders without question. I was wrong. Being human means having the choice to be better than your past. It means having the courage to forgive, even when the world tells you to hate. He turned to Leora and held out his hand. I'm ready. Leora took his hand, her fingers interlaced with his. She looked at the Ethel Council. Let the song begin. They stepped into the resonance font, a pool of shimmering liquid crystal at the center of the hall. As they submerged their joined hands into the liquid, the lattice ignited. A pillar of sapphire light erupted from the font, reaching up toward the station's ceiling and out into the void. This was the shared resonance. Vaxon felt the world dissolve. It wasn't like the vision in the spire. This was raw, unfiltered, and terrifyingly intimate. He felt Leora's mind open to his. He felt her ancient grief, her love for her people, and her profound fear that this wouldn't work. But he also felt her trust in him, a warm, golden light that anchored him in the storm. Then his own mind was laid bare. The galaxy didn't just see his words. They felt his life. They felt the cold weight of the pulse rifle in his hands. They felt the shame he had carried for a decade. They felt the heat of the fires he had lit and the faces of the friends he had lost. But they also felt the moment he decided to save Leora. They felt the wooden bird he had given the girl. They felt the love he had found in the cargo hold of a garbage scow. The link was a bridge of fire. Vaxen felt his bio-neural aegis, the last of the hegemony's grip on his brain, shattering under the weight of the connection. It was a physical pain, like 1,000 needles in his mind, but he didn't pull away. He poured his own will into the link, offering his memories as a sacrifice for the truth. In the gallery, the diplomats and admirals gasped. They weren't just watching a broadcast. They were experiencing the resonance. They felt the Ethel's peaceful intent, and they felt Vaxon's genuine remorse. The prejudice that had been built over 100 years began to crumble, replaced by a sudden, shocking empathy. The light reached a crescendo, a blinding white flare that filled the entire station. Then silence. Vaxon collapsed onto the floor, his breathing ragged. Leora knelt beside him, her hands on his chest, her eyes wide with exhaustion. The sapphire light had faded, replaced by a soft amber glow that seemed to emanate from everyone in the room. Admiral Vance was sitting in his chair, his head in his hands. He was crying, not from fear but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of what he had been part of. General Eris stood up, her face wet with tears. She looked at the Ethel Council, who were also standing, their staves lowered. The link is established, Eris whispered. The truth, it is undeniable. Commander Varan stepped down from the gallery and walked to Vaxen. He looked at the human soldier for a long time, then reached out and placed a hand on Vaxen's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of a conqueror, but of a brother. I was wrong, Vaxen Cross, Varan said. You are not a butcher. You are a pioneer. You have walked through the fire and brought us the light. The treaty was signed that day, not with ink, but with the shared resonance. The sole united hegemony was disbanded, replaced by the convergence of Sol and Ethel. The war was over. 3 months later, the moon of Krios Beta was no longer a death world. It was a sanctuary. Vaxen stood on the porch of the small timber house he had built in the quiet cove. He was wearing simple linen trousers and a worn shirt, his feet bare on the warm, dark soil. He was no longer a soldier. He was a builder. He looked at his hands. They were covered in sawdust and dirt, not blood. He felt a sense of peace that was so profound it almost felt alien. He had spent his life destroying things, and now he was spending it making them grow. Leora walked out of the forest, her hair long and flowing, her indigo markings glowing softly in the twilight. She carried a basket of bluebells, her face radiant with a happiness he had once thought impossible. The council sent a message, she said, leaning against the porch railing beside him. The first joint colony on Xylos is thriving. They are calling the capital Thorn's Rest. Vaxen laughed, a deep, genuine sound. I told them not to use my name. It's too much of a mouthful for the squids. They don't care, she said, her hand finding his. To them, it means the place of second chances. Vaxen pulled her close, his arm a steady weight around her shoulders. They watched the twin suns set over the sea, the violet shadows stretching across the sand. The butcher and the prize had vanished into history. There was only Vaxen and Leora. I spent 15 years encased in armor, believing that my strength was measured by the number of enemies I could put in the ground. I thought that following orders was the highest form of duty, and that my conscience was just a liability to be suppressed by a machine. I was a tool, a weapon, a ghost in a suit of black steel. I saw the Ethel as monsters because it was easier than seeing them as mirrors. But standing on that porch, with the soil of a new world between my toes, I finally understand what I was missing. My journey wasn't about winning a war, or even about saving a princess. It was about saving myself from the lie that I was finished. I realized that my flaws, my scars, and even my sins weren't just burdens to be carried. They were the soil in which my new life had to grow. Forgiveness isn't a gift you wait for. It's a choice you make every single morning when you wake up and decide not to be the person you were yesterday. It's the hardest mission I've ever been on, and there's no medal for it. But when I look at Leora and I see the galaxy we helped build, a place where a child doesn't have to wonder if their father died for a lie, I know that the price was worth it. I was a butcher, but now I am a man, and that is the only rank I ever want to hold again. I have spent so much of my life carrying the weight of my past like a suit of armor, afraid that if I let it go, I would have nothing left to protect me. But I found that it wasn't protection, it was a prison. I wonder, is there a memory or a mistake you have been holding on to, thinking it defines who you are? What would happen if you finally decided that you were more than the worst thing you have ever done? Vaxen turned away from the setting suns and walked into the house, leaving his boots by the door. On the table lay a small carved wooden bird, its wings spread wide as if ready to fly into the dawn. The war was over, but the work of living had just begun. Vaxen smiled at Leora, and together they closed the door on the shadows of the past.